Hey, yeah. So one of my favourite sort of ideas with using Max and Resolume and Live together is that we can easily map individual drum sounds to trigger specific unique parameters. So you might have one drum channel that's got lots of drum samples on it, but then you might want every drum sample to then control a different effect in Resolume in terms of our video. So what I wanted to do today is just to go through the basic setup for that, of how we can achieve that. Let's have a look. Okay, so I've got my live session here, and I've just got two live tracks, and one of them is just a sample that loops. And I won't be doing anything with that one, but my other one is just a MIDI drum loop. And we can see here we've got three samples that we're using, four samples: hi-hat, kick drum, snare drum, and the clave. And so we can sort of play those together. But what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to control different video parameters in Resolume using each of those drum samples individually. So for example, every time the kick drum changes, I want that to change, let's say, the zoom amount of my kaleidoscope effect. Every time the hi-hat changes, I want that to change my input rotation. Every time the, let's say, clave hits, I want that to change my rotation. And every time my snare drum hits, I want that to change my number of angles. So let's have a look at how we can achieve that particular outcome. So over in Live, I've got my two MIDI tracks, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a blank MIDI track that we're going to use to sort of massage our MIDI data to create some control data that we can use for Resolume. So there's a blank MIDI track there. Now, up in my Live preferences, I've got the output of IAC driver bus 1 set to track output, sync output, and remote output, all three to on, which is what I want. Over in Resolume, I've got the same thing set up. So up in my Resolume preferences, I've got my IAC driver bus 1, MIDI input and clock input is set to in and to on. So in other words, I'm going to use my IAC driver bus 1 as a path to send control data from Live over to Resolume. And as a result, I'm going to set my MIDI output from Live to IAC driver bus 1. Next up, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a Max for Live device that I've created sort of for this purpose, called Notes to Accum CC, or Notes Converting to Accumulated CC Data. And I'm going to place that one on my MIDI track. I'm also going to set my MIDI input for my control MIDI track to grab its MIDI data from my drum kit. So from my drum kit channel, which is channel 1 electrified kit 13. And I'm going to set the monitoring to input. And we'll just rename that channel as well, that track. So this Notes to Accumulated CC basically has 4 channels of control data that it can generate. every channel of control data responds to only one unique MIDI note. So for example, channel 1 could be kick drum, channel 2 could be hi-hat, channel 3 clave, and channel 4 snare. And then we can basically set up all these different parameters of how our CC data is generated from that one particular note. So the idea is that we step through different values of CC data every time a new note is triggered. So we'll start off with the kick drum. So the first thing is I need to know which note my kick drum is generating data. If I double click on my drum loop, we can see if I put the mouse over that kick drum, we can see that MIDI note F1 is triggering that note. So I can go across to my control data track, and for my first channel I can set react to note F1 for my drum, my kick drum. Number of steps we might set to 4, direction we want is up, minimum data out might be, let's say, around 32, maximum might be 64. I can always change these in a moment. CC number we'll set to 0. Notes enable we want to set to off. CC out to on. And data glide we'll set to 0 for now. So what I want to do now is just hit play on my drum track. And what I want to do is go across to Resolume, and I want to activate MIDI mapping mode in Resolume, edit composition MIDI map, and I'm going to click on the parameter that I want to map to that kick drum. I'm going to choose the zoom on my kaleidoscope. Then I can hit play live, and we can see that's mapped controller 0 from channel 1 to my zoom. So now if I exit MIDI map mode again, we should see there that my kick drum is now being mapped to the zoom of that kaleidoscope. So we can actually adjust that mapping data a little bit from live as well. We can sort of repeat those steps for a couple of my other drum sounds. So next up we've got closed hi-hat, which is sitting there on D sharp 2. So I'll use my second data strip here, into D sharp 2 as the note to react to. Step you might want to set to 32. In and out might be 0 and 64, CC number 1. Now in order to map it, we'll just need to enable just that data column, and we need to disable the first one, so that we're only sending MIDI data to map it. Across in Resolume, let's map that hi-hat to input rotation, and we can see there that it's mapped from channel 1, controller number 1, exit MIDI map, and we can see there that it's being mapped. Now, what I can do as well is I can set a bit of glide time for my zoom in milliseconds. The same for my hi-hat. And then let's just deal with the clave as well. So the clave is sitting on C#1. So let's set up our third data column, C#1. Let's make it 4 steps, moving both up and down, on controller 2. Have some range of data, and then we'll activate just that third data column, so that when we map it to, let's say, rotation, then it only maps that controller. Then finally, we've got the snare drum. So let's map that one to a new effect. Let's go with, let's say, blur. And we can map it just to the opacity of the blur effect. So going back to our snare, the snare is on E1. It's our fourth column. We'll set the mode ramp to E1. 8, 9. Let's go up and down. From 0 to 64. Map it to controller 3. Turn on just that channel for mapping. And there we go. So we can actually, of course, increase that tempo as well. And it will follow along. It's always fun experimenting with the glide amount as well. So if we just increase the glide amount a little bit like that. So, there we go. Hopefully that gives you a couple of ideas. You can get some pretty interesting effects by tightly syncing up individual drum sounds to a wide variety of video effects. So it's kind of a cool thing. Anyway, hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned for more, etc.